Hey there, I'm Javed. I'm a software engineer and I make videos about my experiences in life. In this video, I want to talk about something very important and something which I see a lot in the industry. Whenever I teach something, the breakage barrier to enter coding is really difficult to understand how the syntax is, how the code is starting and how the code is ending. Some basic concepts. So that's why I'm making this video so that you can get an abstract understanding of what is happening. Remember, this is not a hands-on coding video. This is like more general discussion, teaching you the basic concepts in a layman language. Now, let's get into the video. Look, you need to understand one thing about coding. Coding is not about writing lines or algorithms. It's about solving a problem. That should be your main mindset. You also need to write the code to solve a particular problem. Whenever we write any kind of program, there is a starting point and there is an ending point. Remember this one, okay? No matter what program you write, there is always going to be a starting point and then there is an end point. So that's very, very important. If you get the starting point, you can trace the code to the end point. That's how you read the other's code. So that's how I do it. I look for a starting point and then I start tracing the code. That way I get a complete knowledge of the code base. This is pretty clear. We have a starting point and then we have an end point. Every programming language have their own syntax, which starts at some point and then which ends at some point. That's pretty standard in every programming language, irrespective of the technology which you choose. It could be a Java, Python, Swift, anything. There is a starting point and then there is an end point. Okay, that's very, very important, which you need to understand. Whenever you see a code, you might be overwhelmed by looking at some random characters, right? So don't be. There is something called OOPS. OOPS basically stands for Object-Oriented Programming Language. Okay? And why do we need this one? So some programming languages initially were used to execute sequentially. What do I mean by that? When we say sequentially, they'll execute line by line, one after the other. But in the modern technologies, in the modern programming languages, you can hop on to one instruction to another, irrespective of their execution order. Okay, that's how you write the code. That's where the OOPS concept comes in. When we say object-oriented programming, in the name itself, we call it objects. We create objects and we call them whenever we need them. Okay, have this pretty basic understanding of what OOPS means. I hope now you know what OOPS means. Now let's get into the nitty-gritties of OOPS. For example, we have something called class. Now, what is class? To give you a best example, consider our body as a class where you write a complete behavior. For example, I am Javed and this is my body. I create a class called Javed. All my functionalities, characteristics, memory, everything I store in that class, all my behavior. If you create a class with my name, that class's main intention is to work like me. That's all. There are different programming languages which will allow you to create things, variables, function. Don't worry about variables and functions. Just remember these names: variables, functions, data storing without creating a class. But in some programming languages, you need to create a class to do any kind of programming. For example, if I tell you in Java, you need to create a class to do any kind of programming. But in Swift, you don't need to. You can directly create a function or directly store a variable without creating a class. That's how it works. Once we are good with class, once we understood what class means, it contains a lot of internal structures. For example, functions. Now, what does function mean? We're taking an example of a human body, right? Now, our whole body is class. But if you see, we also have hands, legs, eyes, right? Let's call them as functions. Whenever you need a hand requirement, your class or your structure or your mind will call a function called hand. You can reuse it, right? You won't be creating a hand whenever you need it. Hands are there, you're just calling the function. You're just calling the hands whenever you need it. That's very, very important when it comes to functions. You create a function, you add some kind of functionality to it, like for example, hand, and then you call it again. That's how everything works. Remember this. This is a very, very important concept. Okay. I am in a tunnel now, so let's wait for a minute. 1, 2, 3. Awesome. Okay. I hope you're clear with the function. Now we have covered class and then we have covered functions. Class is like a overall broader structure. Function is a part of that class. I hope you're clear with the class and function definitions. Now let's look into what are variables. What do we mean by variables? Is it varying or something like that? No. Variables are, I know name sounds pretty confusing when it comes to English definition, but in programming, when we say variables, it's basically to store the data. We took human body as example, right? So in our body, we store everything in our mind, right? It's kind of basket or a storage device. Similarly, we need something to store our data inside a program. To give you an actual software example, I hope you used any food delivery application. In that, if you see, the moment you log in, by the time you exit after ordering, it needs to store a lot of data. For example, your name, your address, what you ordered, what you selected, your payment details. All those things need to be stored somewhere and can be retrievable easily. That's where we use variables. We store the data in program using variables. That's very, very important to understand. This is where I see a lot of people are struggling, like what are the variables? What are the functions, classes? It's so overwhelming to hear all these things, and then after seeing that code, you will lose motivation. I know that. I have seen many people doing that one, even at some point I have been through. So we are done with class, function and variable. Now inside variables also, we need to define the data, right? Since we are taking mind as an example to store the data, we have different regions for different kind of memories, right? So similar to that one, we have something called data types. Look, data types are pretty straightforward. Whenever you create a variable, you define what kind of data type it is. For example, the data could be a string like a sentence, or a number, or a decimal point, or a true or false boolean, like that. So there are different types of data types which we need to understand. Once you start coding, you will get to know about these data types. There are like string, which we call it for sentences, char is basically for character, integer for numbers, and then floating point or double for decimal points. These are like very important ones, but if you dig more into these data types, you will see many more according to the language. Okay, my signal is green now. Let me go. So let's revise the concepts once. We have classes like a whole structure, and then functions, and then we have variables to store the data, and then data types, which defines what kind of data it is. That's pretty clear. Now comes what? Now we have statements. To give you an example, I woke up in the morning and then I started making decisions whether to brush my teeth or not, whether to eat breakfast or not. Like that, we have statements to help us to make a decision based upon a particular scenario. These are the declarative statements. To give you an example, we have if statement. For example, do this if something is true. Do this if something is meeting a criteria, like that. We have if else, and then while, do while, and then we have switch. Like that, we have conditional statements. Based upon the condition, it chooses the path. You might give like hundreds of paths to choose. You might give one or two paths to choose. You might add a check to whether do this only when a certain criteria meets. That's why we have statements. If you are entering into programming, these are all the concepts you need to know. First is there is a starting point and then there is an ending point. Second, we have a class as whole structure. Inside a class, we have functions, variables, data types and conditional statements. This is all in the programming. Look, this is good enough for a junior developer or a person who's entering into coding. Remember that. This is not the end of programming. Do not worry about what comes next, because the more you have the experience, right, you'll start understanding what are reactive programming, multi-threading, how to manage security, how to make a secure API calls, all those things. Those are next step. You don't need those things at this point if you are still entering into coding. This is very, very important concept. Do not get into very complex concept at this point. Just concentrate on how the programming is starting, how the flow is happening, what is the syntax, classes, variables, data types, functions, and conditional statements. Master these things, understand these things properly, then you start getting into more complex concept. I hope that is clear. This is a video which I expected to have when I was learning coding, but now you have it. I'll see you in the next video.